We can know certain things just by common sense, like anyone who puts pineapple on pizza needs to be deported to Delaware. Hey guys, welcome back to Kingdom Craft, where I build this church in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. This is my underground church, and today I'm going to make a secret passage up to the walls of my original above-ground church while I talk about something called Scottish Commonsense Realism. You might not know what that is, but if you're American, which I think about 50% of you are, you've been influenced by it. So, Scottish Commonsense Realism is a Scottish philosophy, no surprise, from the Enlightenment. And if you guys don't know what the Enlightenment is, I'm not a philosopher, but basically it's when a bunch of big nerdy philosophers began questioning everything, began questioning all traditional notions of philosophy and logic and theology and even God, and one thing led to another, and that's why we have Drag Queen Story Hour in the modern world. The Enlightenment led to everything modern, everything liberal, because the Enlightenment started by skepticism. Skepticism is when a bunch of philosophers like René Descartes and David Hume began questioning all the things that people used to just assume were true. People used to assume God exists. People used to assume that the things we talk about are actual real things that exist in the real world and not just figments of our imagination. People used to assume that when one thing normally happens after another thing, it's because the first thing actually caused the second thing. But Descartes and Hume, Descartes was a Catholic French guy, and Hume was a Scottish guy, although Hume was not really religious. He got in trouble with the Scottish authorities, because the Scottish authorities were strict Presbyterians. Hume questioned everything. Hume was like, how do we know anything? How do we know that God exists? How do we know that one thing causes another thing? Hume said that we can't really know if anything causes another thing necessarily. Here's what I mean. Normally, we think that if I break this block in Minecraft, me clicking my mouse caused this block in Minecraft to break. But David Hume would say that's not necessarily true. It could just be a coincidence that every time you click your mouse with your mouse hovering over this block, that block happens to break. But you don't know that you clicking the mouse actually caused the block to break for necessarily. He'd also say that, just because we see that it's light outside when the sun is up, we think the sun causes it to be light outside. But we can't actually prove that. It could just be a crazy coincidence that anytime we go outside and the sun is out, it's also light out, right? David Hume would say that there's no way to actually prove any cause and effect relationship. Because hypothetically, let's say every time you went outside and you saw the sun, you happened to smell dog poop in the area as well for a completely unrelated reason. If by some coincidence that always happened to you every time you went outside, and if you were watching my video instead of doing homework, I don't think you go outside that much, but let's pretend that you're someone who goes outside, then you would think the sun smells like dog poop if every time you went outside and saw the sun, you also happened to smell dog poop for a different reason. So basically, obviously this is absurd. We intuitively know that some things cause other things. We intuitively know there is a cause and effect relationship between things. And what does a cause and effect relationship mean? A cause and effect relationship means that two events don't just happen to happen next to each other by coincidence. It means that the first event actually contains the reason for the second event happening. So if the first event is the first domino falling, and the second event is the second domino falling, the first event actually caused the second event. The first domino falling contains the reason for why the second domino fell, and then the second domino falling contains the reason for why the third domino fell. So cause and effect relationships are just basically dominoes. And this is intuitively what we sense is true with most cause and effect relationships. But David Hume is saying, okay, we can assume that, but there's no way to actually prove that. And in some sense, he is right. There's no way to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that cause and effect relationships really exist. David Hume is technically correct about the old saying that correlation doesn't equal causation. For example, just because there is a correlation between someone being from New York and that person being super duper smart, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're smart because they're from New York. I think the real reason is they're from New York because they're smart. All the smart people are going to move to New York because it's the best state. And we know that it's the best because all the smartest people say it's the best, and the smartest people are from New York. And the reason David Hume doubted the existence of God is because the traditional arguments for God, like Thomas Aquinas' arguments, rely on cause and effect relationships. Thomas Aquinas defined God as the first cause, but David Hume says there's no way to prove that cause and effect actually exists. But even if we can't prove it, everyone knows deep down that cause and effect relationships do exist. Everyone lives as though they exist, even David Hume. It's not like David Hume went around touching hot stoves because he knew that if he did that, that would cause his hand to burn. It's common sense, and that is what the Scottish Commonsense Realist philosophers said in response to David Hume. So basically, if you want to know what Scottish Commonsense Realism is, I don't think you did want to know what that was before you clicked on this video, but you did click on this video, so that means you kind of wanted to know in some sense. You clicking on the video caused you to hear about what Scottish Commonsense Realism is. It's a conservative response to the skepticism, the Enlightenment skepticism of David Hume. So David Hume was in Scotland, he was Scottish, he was not religious. He didn't explicitly identify as atheist, but he did not explicitly identify as Christian either. And the Presbyterian Church, which was the established Church of Scotland, still technically is, even though it's abandoned a lot of its principles, the Presbyterian Church didn't like him. Alright, so David Hume got in trouble for questioning everything, and the Scottish Commonsense Realism was a response, a conservative response to David Hume, saying, yeah, technically David Hume has got a few points, but we need to trust in our common sense to be able to know anything. So common sense realism is what I would call the ultimate blue pill ideology. In modern, young men's internet rhetoric, the red pill is like realizing that all of reality is a lie. It often refers to things like realizing that you're never going to get a girlfriend and some of those incel movements, which I don't recommend getting involved in. The red pill language means realizing the entire world is a lie, and I think that language is kind of Gnostic. The blue pill ideology it comes from the Matrix. The red pill is where you get freed from the Matrix, you realize all of reality is a lie. The blue pill is you stay under the delusion. But common sense realism is actually a sort of blue pill ideology because it claims, no, reality is not a lie. Generally, things are the way they seem. So if you think that generally things are the way you intuitively perceive them to be, generally if you think that because the seeing the sun in the sky causes it to be light out, since you perceive that, that's probably true. Scottish Common Sense Realism would say that if you intuitively perceive something is true, that means it probably is true. So basically, Scottish Common Sense Realism was a way to try and protect traditional notions of reality and thereby traditional notions of God and theology. So it's no surprise that a lot of the Presbyterians in Scotland adopted Scottish Common Sense Realism to defend the claims of Christianity from Enlightenment skepticism. And for a while, this worked really well. A famous Presbyterian theologian who adopted Scottish Common Sense Realism is Hugh Blair, and I've read some of his sermons. They're like the best sermons. Let me tell you. Best sermons, folks. You've never seen sermons like this. Never. Really good preacher. Really good Scottish Presbyterian preacher. Hugh Blair. In a seminary library that I went to, a mainline seminary library, I found like a very, very old book with the pages yellow and with the S's still looking like F's from some of his sermons, and I read his sermons directly out of that book. Really awesome. 1700s Scottish Presbyterian preacher. Another Scottish Presbyterian who was influenced by Scottish Common Sense Realism was John Witherspoon. And then John Witherspoon came to America, and he became president of Princeton University. It wasn't called that at the time, but it's what is now Princeton University. As you guys know, Princeton was founded by Presbyterians. I talked about that a couple episodes ago when I compared the theology of Princeton University to Mercersburg theology in Pennsylvania. So, yeah. Witherspoon became president of Princeton University, and he taught Scottish Common Sense Realism to the students at Princeton. And because Princeton was like America's major Presbyterian school, Presbyterianism in America after that became defined essentially by Scottish Common Sense Realism. That became the mainstream, philosophical position of American Presbyterians. So John Witherspoon had a massive influence on the church, but he also had a massive influence on the American culture more broadly as well, because he wasn't just a pastor and theologian, he was a founding father of America. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He was the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence, and he was a Presbyterian, so I think that's pretty cool, and that's more evidence that America was founded upon Presbyterian principles, and that means America should always be a Presbyterian nation. I'm just saying. Presbyterians have always excelled in sort of law and politics and stuff. There's been tons of Presbyterian presidents. There's never been a Lutheran president. That's kind of interesting. I'm just going to say. Anyway, the reason is because Lutherans are German and Presbyterians are British. It's actually not something, it's not anything that special, but I still like to make occasional digs like that. Anyway, so John Witherspoon's common sense philosophy, his Scottish common sense realism, it didn't just influence... Why are there always so many chickens in my church? I think David Hume sent all these chickens to make me skeptical of my own existence. So Scottish common sense realism influenced the Presbyterian Church, and it also influenced America. And John Witherspoon used common sense philosophy to argue in support of the American Revolution. He said it's just common sense that if Britain is mistreating us, we should sort of govern our own affairs because we've already kind of been doing that for a while, and Britain just recently started imposing all these tea taxes on us. Yeah, John Witherspoon used common sense philosophy to argue for the American Revolution. Okay, finally, I got one of these trees to grow. I spent like half the episode just trying to get some wood. Witherspoon used common sense, and Thomas Paine also wrote a book called Common Sense. Unfortunately, Thomas Paine really wasn't that Christian, but his book, Common Sense, it was like the most published book in America, and it helped fuel support for the American Revolution amongst the American people. And common sense has defined so much of American religion and American secular life in general. It's another example of Presbyterians basically controlling the world behind the scenes. It's not the Illuminati that controls the world, it's Presbyterians. Because Presbyterians, we just know what we're talking about. So in America, Americans generally don't put up with nonsense. Americans want things to be clear and make sense and be simple enough to understand. That's how American religion works. Scottish common sense philosophy influenced a lot of the American church. Not just in terms of the churches having very more simple, rationalized common sense philosophy, but also in the fact that American churches stayed conservative longer than European churches did. Because Scottish common sense philosophy, it is fundamentally, I think, a conservative philosophy, because it is a reaction against the skepticism of David Hume and all the Enlightenment stuff. So it is a reason, I think, why America did stay conservative longer than Europe. Both America and Europe eventually did get hijacked by secular leftism, but it happened a lot more quickly in Europe. It was like in the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s, most European countries became a lot more secular, and traditional Christian beliefs were replaced by extremist secular ideologies like communism and fascism. All the while, America was still quite religious, quite socially conservative, and all of that. And I think part of the reason for that is Scottish common sense realism. Because Scottish common sense realism told people to listen to their common sense and not listen to the yap of weird German philosophers who said the entire world is a lie and now we all need to become communist or something. Right? So I think temporarily, and for its time, Scottish common sense realism was very good. I do think it had some negative effects, though. And I did talk about that in the episode a couple episodes ago where I compared the theology of Princeton Seminary, which is largely based on Scottish common sense realism, with Mercersburg theology in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, which was a bit more based on German idealism, and was more based on some of the Enlightenment ideas. But I think it was in somewhat of a good way. Here's what I mean. So yes, it is good that common sense did temporarily hold off some of the modern secular decay of society. But I think Scottish common sense did kill a bit of the mysticism that used to exist in the Presbyterian tradition. Before the Enlightenment and before the reaction against the Enlightenment, or at least the reaction against certain Enlightenment skepticism, there was a lot of mystical sacramentology in the Presbyterian tradition. If you read the way the Scottish Covenanters speak about spirituality and the sacraments, it's very powerful, very mystical. You know, Samuel Rutherford, probably the most important Scottish Covenanter theologian, he says that baptism is a mystical, hyper-physical means of salvation. He says baptism saves, which most modern Presbyterians don't say. John Knox, the founder of Presbyterianism, he also said baptism saves. He says that we really receive the body and blood of Christ in communion, and it's sort of so that we can become one with Christ. that language of like theosis, or rather Christocentric theosis, doesn't really appear in later Presbyterians until, I think, very recently when some of these ideas were revived. So there's a lot of reasons why I think sacramentology gradually decreased in the Presbyterian tradition. I think the revivals had more to do with it, but I think Scottish Commonsense Realism was partially behind some of the low sacramentology taught at Princeton Seminary, because, Presbyterians believe that baptism does save, but only because it's like a sign that's united to the thing it signifies. It's kind of complicated, and it doesn't make common sense. I will admit that Presbyterian sacramentology is kind of complicated. It's also complicated, the Trinity in Christology. Often in theology, the truth is a lot more hard to understand than errors. Like, it's a lot more simple to say, oh yeah, God is just one being, one person, or that there's three gods and three persons. One being in three persons can be kind of hard to understand. That doesn't mean it's not true. That doesn't mean we should abandon it just because it confuses people. The same is true of Presbyterian sacramentology. We believe that baptism does save, but not necessarily at the time it's administered, and only if you're elect. That can be confusing to some people. So I think since the Princeton theologians adopted so much of this common sense philosophy, they wanted everything to just make common sense to people, they moved away from preaching about sacramental efficacy, because if we don't think the sacraments have any ex opere operato efficacy, that means automatic efficacy like the Roman Catholics believe. If we don't believe that, if we believe the sacraments only work sometimes, that doesn't really make sense to say the sacraments actually do anything more than what they symbolize. So that's why the Princeton theologians like Charles Hodge and Beebe Warfield tend to talk about the sacraments as if they're mostly just symbolic. They will say the sacraments do have some sort of efficacy, but only because they remind us of things. So that means they're basically just symbolic. And Samuel Rutherford, who is one of the authors of the Westminster Confession, so he's obviously way more authoritative than them. What Samuel Rutherford says is completely the opposite. He says if baptism is only a means of grace because of what it symbolizes, then he says that baptism would be just as much of a means of grace to people in the audience watching the baptism than for the person being baptized. He says baptism needs to have something more than just a symbolic efficacy. He says baptism is a hyper-physical means of salvation. But you won't hear that from the Princeton theologians. And you won't hear that from the people influenced by the Princeton theologians, which is a lot of modern conservative Presbyterianism today. So I really think Princeton theology killed all the mysticism in the Reformed tradition, and Mercersburg theology, which I talked about a couple videos ago, was trying to revive that. And because Princeton theology was sort of the dominant American school of Reformed thought, at least in the Presbyterian tradition, it sort of became mainstream amongst all Presbyterians in America, not just the Princeton ones. And then after the whole J. Gresham Machen thing, J. Gresham Machen sort of left the PCUSA and started the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which is like the schismatic conservative offshoot denomination. And then he founded Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia to basically continue the theological tradition of Old Princeton. And that's why, if you go to your average conservative Presbyterian church today in America, they'll probably say baptism doesn't save. There are exceptions, I know, and it's good that there are exceptions, but exceptions don't define the rule. And I think you can trace that low sacramentology all the way back to Old Princeton, and I think the low sacramentology of Princeton was partially, not entirely, influenced by Scottish Commonsense Realism. But I do want to end on a good note. And because Scottish Commonsense Realism was so influential to America, and because it has Scottish in the name, and anything that's Scottish is inherently good because Scotland is awesome, the way evangelicals feel about Israel, that's how I feel about Scotland. Let me just say. Yeah, so because everything Scottish is awesome, I want to end on a good note. Well, I think you might be able to draw a connection between the Scottish Commonsense Realism and the low sacramentology at Princeton. I think a simpler explanation for the low sacramentology at Princeton is just revivalism. Revivalism that appeals to people's emotions and psychology more than anything objective. And I will say, to its credit, Scottish Commonsense Realism strongly opposed the revivalism. Jonathan Edwards was a strong revivalist. He was one of those new side people. I guess he's new light, because new side specifically refers to the Presbyterian Church, and he wasn't Presbyterian. Jonathan Edwards was new light, and he was briefly very influential at Princeton Seminary, Princeton University, rather. Princeton Seminary was founded later. But when John Witherspoon came over to America and he brought Scottish Commonsense Realism, he actually moved away from a lot of Jonathan Edwards' ideas. He didn't like how emotionalist Edwards was. He didn't like how a lot of Edwards' preaching focused on the supernatural and the emotional and the psychological. Witherspoon wanted to focus more on rationality rather than emotions. So, to put it simply, Edwards was more focused on feelings, and Witherspoon was more focused on facts. And as everyone's favorite theologian, Ben Shapiro, I'm being sarcastic, says, facts don't care about your feelings, and it is a profoundly conservative impulse to care more about facts than feelings. And look over here, I've made a little hidey hole. I can spy on my above ground church from right here. So that's about it for this video. I just want to give a brief overview of my thoughts on Scottish Commonsense Realism. I'm going to do another chapter of the whole Mastering Reformed Theology series. So once I do that, then I'm going to go more in depth on Scottish Commonsense Realism and its influence on the Presbyterian Church today. But these are just my initial thoughts. A lot of times Kingdom Craft is like the rough draft for my more finalized videos later. So thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you all later.